Welcome to the Rochester, New Hampshire History Podcast, a monthly show that will shine a light on a piece of history that has been all but forgotten.
The Historical Society Museum on Hanson Street is home to thousands of artifacts that encompass hundreds of years of Rochester history. Local museums provide a sense of community by celebrating a collective heritage and offer a great way to know the history of the area. In this episode, we will look at 6 items from the museum. Some of these pieces may seem commonplace, but when you hear the rest of the story, they become extraordinary pieces of local history.
An ordinary-looking cobblestone resides on the second floor of the museum. One may ask, what does this stone have to do with the local history? To answer that question, one has to go back to the 1840s. When the railroad was established in Rochester in 1849, both foot traffic and carriage traffic between the center of town and the depot began to increase. The railroad desired a road that went directly from the depot to the center of town. Back then, Ebenezer Hansen owned much property in the downtown. He obliged the railroad and built Hanson Street on his own land with his own funds. The new private road permitted a direct route from the depot into the town. Ebenezer profited by leasing the land and buildings on Hanson Street to merchants. Hanson Street became a bustling avenue, with only about 500 feet in length. Almost every kind of business and profession was to be found on it, including a stable, blacksmith, restaurants, grocery stores, undertaker, and a tailor. Did you know that to retain it as a private street, Dominicus had to close Hanson Street for 24 hours once every 20 years? Originally, it was just a dirt road, but in 1901, Dominicus paved the street with 56,000 granite blocks, creating a cobblestone road. This was an improvement, as cobblestone streets did not develop ruts, nor did they get dusty or muddy like dirt roads. It was also beautiful, as it looked like a street from an old European city. After the death of Dominicus Hansen in 1907, the city gained ownership of the street, and in 1949 the street was paved over. The beautiful cobblestones disappeared, and it looked like every other street. This cobblestone in the museum was taken out of Hanson Street before it was paved. It is a reminder of the days when Hanson Street was a bustling thoroughfare and was paved with cobblestones.
On the first floor hangs an oval sign with the words M. Ferber's Tavern, 1806. This lettering is on both sides of the sign. This sign advertised a tavern that was located by the Rochester Common and was a 2-story building. The tavern was located where Kelly's Furniture was, and more recently, a health clinic. This was donated to the Historical Society in 1951 and is the original sign used at the tavern. This is one of the oldest advertising items we have of any Rochester business.
This looks like a torture device or a medieval weapon. It has sharp, handmade nails driven through a wooden base. It was made in 1773. It is actually a tool that was found on many farms in the 1700s. It is handmade and called a hetchel or a flax comb. It's local, as it was recently donated from an old Rochester farm to the Historical Society. It is used to create the fibers that are made into fabric. Flax or cotton was drawn through the bed of iron nails to clean and straighten the fibers, similar to pulling a comb through hair. When all of the long, usable fibers are ready, they are wound onto a pole and ready for the spinning process, which would make it suitable for weaving into linen.
On the second floor of the museum, the windows are graced with beautiful curtains. However, these are not ordinary curtains, just used to block or obscure light. What could be the story behind these curtains? To answer that question, we have to go back to the 1870s. In 1876, Ebenezer G. Wallace was a co-owner of the Wallace Shoe Company. The shoe factory occupied over 5 acres of land and became the largest shoe factory in the state. It enabled Ebenezer to become a very rich man. With his wealth, he built an impressive Victorian house on South Main Street in 1876. His house was an example of a Victorian architecture at its best. These curtains that currently hang on the second floor of the museum are the same curtains that graced Ebenezer's grand house. In 1976, Ebenezer Wallace's house was demolished and was replaced by Friendly's Restaurant. Before the bulldozers started the demolition, some pieces were sold to the highest bidders. Fortunately, these curtains were saved from destruction and found their way to the Historical Society.
On the second floor are a collection of thermometers that advertise local businesses. Once upon a time, thermometers were everywhere. They were advertisements with a mercury tube in them, bearing images of everything from soda to motor oil, farms, banks, and tobacco. The heyday of advertising thermometers was from 1920 to 1950. Most businesses got in on it, and thermometers advertising products or services were found in homes and stores. Companies figured out that if an advertisement was also a useful object, such as a clock or a thermometer, it would stay up in the store longer than an ordinary sign. The Historical Society has many of these thermometers from local businesses on display. They beckon back to a time before the local TV news weather report or the internet.
On the first floor is a heavy cast iron post. One has to go back to the early 1880s to see how this relates to our local history. When the stone arch bridge that spans the Cachiko River was built in the 1880s, it was 133 feet long and 50 feet wide. It was constructed with 3 giant stone arches. There was also a fence on both sides of the bridge that was supported by several cast iron posts. When one views old pictures of the bridge, one can see the fence and the iron posts. Perhaps one of your ancestors leaned on this fence to take in the view. This old fence was replaced and scrapped. Luckily, one of the posts was saved and donated to the museum for future generations to enjoy.
This ends the podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email bobgriffinpodcast@gmail.com and come back next month for another episode of Rochester, New Hampshire History.